Martin, I think this is one tailor-made for Simon. So many people getting in touch this morning. And I'll just take one at random. There's Brett. Surely, Chelsea in breach of FFP. What are they doing? This cannot be right. Chelsea have now broken the British transfer record twice in the space of a few months. And the Caicedo deal, if it goes through, Martin, will take them to more than £800 million spent in just over a year under the new Todd Boehly ownership. So Chelsea will now have paid Brighton, incidentally, almost $200 million on player and managerial signings. I mean, when it boils down to it, Simon, explain this to us. I mean, has Boehly been more disruptive to the Premier League landscape than the likes of Abramovich ever was?
Well, you have to look and see what he's doing, because no one's bought a football club for £2.5 billion. So Abramovich bought it off Ken Bates 20-odd years ago and paid a certain amount of money and then went on a spending spree. And if you price in inflation, it's comparable to what Todd Boehly's doing. I don't like it. I think it is prolific and profligate. But you also have to look at what he's actually doing. He believes, I think, that is much more revenue around in the football world than is currently being achieved, whether it's digitally or a variety of different opportunities that Chelsea believe they're going to build. But here's what's happening with their transfer spend. And here's what's happening with their ability to be able to adhere. I think they'll struggle to do it in a longer game if they don't start getting some achievements on the pitch. But here's where they really are. They've spent £800 million on players. They spent $600 million last year. They capitalised that over 8 years. All those players were on 8-year contracts. So all of a sudden, that £600 million spend is reducing at £75 million a year. So you're charging $75 million because you're dividing 600 by 8. Right, you're reducing your 600 million spend by 75 million every year. He's now had that change because they didn't like it. The football fraternity went, you can't do that over 8 years. We only want it back to 5. So this year's spend, right, will be 300 million, around about that.
Right.
And it'll be reducing at 60 million a year. So he's now losing 75 million each year from the spend last year, plus 60 this year. But he's gone and sold 250 million worth of players in 3 transfer windows, and all of those players have produced an outcome that have been profitable to Chelsea. He sold Kai Havertz for 60-odd million quid. He bought him for 60-odd million quid, but on his balance sheet at the time, when he sold Kai Havertz, he was carrying him at 25 million. So he sold him for 60, he's booked a 35 million pound profit. He sold Mason Mount, who's an academy player, for 60 million quid. He's booked a 60 million pound profit. So over the 3 windows, he's booked somewhere in the region of 200 million worth of transfer gains on his balance sheet, and he's reducing it by 135 every year. So he's 65 million pound in credit right now on his balance sheet against transfers. That's how he's doing it. Now, eventually, if Chelsea don't pull up revenue and start to get back in the Champions League or generate other revenue streams, this is going to catch up with him sooner rather than later. But right now, £800 million worth of spend, it equates to £135 million a year worth of transfer losses, or depreciation. And then you've got 200 million worth of transfer gains on Havertz, on Mason Mount, on Ruben Loftus-Cheek, and on we go. Look who they've sold.
But it's a gamble in the longer term. Well, if they don't start doing it,
it's a gamble.
On the pitch.
It's a gamble in terms of the consequence around financial fair play. Now let's look at what the consequence is. The consequence in financial fair play is a financial consequence, right? Are we suggesting that people that have paid £2.5 billion for a business that are funding £800 million of transfers won't take a smack on the knuckles like other clubs are getting right now? 10 million here, 20 million pounds there. I'm not suggesting he's aiming for that, but right now people are saying, how the hell can you spend £800 million on transfer fees and not be breaching financial fair play? Well, I've just told you, if you're depreciating that at £135 million a year, and you've just sold 260 million pounds worth of players over 3 transfer windows, and most of those players, with the exception of Timo Werner, which was sold at break even, are booking you a profit, you've just covered the last 18 months worth of potential losses and going into next year as well. Now, in 18 months' time, if Chelsea are still spending at this level, are still carrying that level of depreciation, haven't balanced the books by selling more players, and haven't got themselves into the Champions League, then they're going to get caught.
I'm with you. So answer me this. Could Sullivan and West Ham, I know it sounds ridiculous, but I'll put it to you, go in something of a similar spending spree because in the longer terms, they'll have balanced the books with 105 for Declan and maybe, dare I say it, right now, 70 for Paqueta.
But here's the thing, right? What did I tell you about Newcastle? I said to you, Newcastle can spend money and they can spend big money and they'll spend 120, 150 million. No, they won't. They've got no money. It's not a bottomless pit. They've gone in and spent another 150 million quid, Newcastle. They spent 150 to 200 million last year. Since they've walked through the door, the Saudis will have spent somewhere in the region of 300 or 400 million quid, getting close to that, right? And no one's talking about the complications of Newcastle's financial fair play, and they've only just got into the Champions League for the first season. So they can do it, but of course it's again how they spend their money and how much profit they've got in players. Declan Rice is a straightforward 100 million to profit. So they've now got a player that was an academy player, that's got no carrying value. The moment they sell him for £100 million, they've booked £100 million profit on that transfer. Now, of course, other players that they've bought previously, they're carrying a legacy of losses and also players that are depreciating. There'll be, and this is why Boehly's made a Horlicks of the on-field stuff right now in terms of the managers that he's chosen and the performance he got from the team last year. But the economics, this guy doesn't spend. I'm not admiring it, by the way. I'm explaining it. This guy doesn't spend £2.5 billion on a football club and doesn't know the ramifications of the economic model that he's building. He may not know a football manager from a pound of sprouts, but he does know the economics of business, and that's why they're okay at Chelsea. They will be able to, unless they've carried huge losses in the last 3 years that haven't been qualified by COVID and things of that nature. They're okay, Chelsea. So they're okay, like Everton were.
As explained by Mr. Jordan, that's how Boehly's doing it, Martin.
Well, that's a brilliant explanation, I must admit, because I didn't realise. I obviously knew about depreciation. Just tell me then, Simon, so I know financial fair play didn't exist at that time when you were at Crystal Palace, but did you work the same sort of model in terms of depreciation of players?
Of course you do. It's been a standard principle for years, and that's how you value players. I think it's an unfair principle because if you've got a player on your balance sheet and like Declan Rice, on West Ham's balance sheet, he couldn't prop up their balance sheet economically because he was worth nothing in terms of capitalisation. But in market prices, he's worth 100 million quid. And the only time they could have ever capitalised that is when they sold him. And I often think that's a flawed perspective for football because it doesn't help football clubs look economically solvent. And if they're going to be governed by depreciation, they need some help. And I think the football authorities, without boring people lecturing economics, should look at it differently. And I also think it's preposterous. If you buy a building and you own it for 10 years, you can write it down over 10 years. If you buy a player and you want to put him on a contract for 8 years, that's your funeral economically, so you should be able to capitalise it. And because all the guys suddenly saw Boehly doing this, they all went, we're not having that. 8-year contracts, you can depreciate over 8-year contracts. It means the depreciation is less. We want you back to 5.
And in fact,
I think that's silly.
Another one at Chelsea's just out the door, Martin. In the last few minutes, Kepa, the goalkeeper, Kepa Arrizabalaga, has just joined Real Madrid in a season-long loan deal. But Martin, you look at it. When it comes to players, Caicedo, 115 mil. Declan, 105. Enzo Maresca, 106. Endo Fernandez, that should be. Jude Bellingham, 88, rising to 115. What has happened to the premium midfielder market in recent months? Because these are ridiculous amounts of money that are being spent. Enzo Fernandez, 106 plus. Caicedo, 115. Where is the sensible fee in all of this?
Well, as Simon has just explained, if we think that they're ridiculous, but even so, that's the market, and if someone is prepared to pay that there, then well and good. So I think let's put Declan Rice in it. Declan Rice has been talked all over the summertime around about £100 million, and we're talking about this here for a supposedly defensive midfield player who might not score that number of goals. But the more players now that come in this, like around about 110, 115, 120. If I'm Declan Rice, I'll feel pretty comfortable about it now because I'm not under severe pressure anymore. It's a wee bit like Trevor Francis arriving for the first £1 million, and Trevor was very concerned. He was very nervous about it, because he was holding this £1 million. But once he got going, once he started to score a few goals, and once then the market, within not so long as you've just mentioned there, Simon, the £1 million became, £1.5 million and things like this here. And then suddenly Trevor's thinking, well, I'm fantastic value because I've just scored in the European Cup final. So the point I'm saying to you is it's what you're having to pay for it. Are we... yes, we're sitting around here and we're amazed that we're spending, that teams are buying, let's say, defensive midfield players essentially for £100 million.
It's insane, isn't it? Here's another one that could be insane in terms of numbers involved. Neymar, looks like Al Hilal in Saudi Arabia have agreed a deal with Paris Saint-Germain to sign Neymar. You can imagine some of the figures going on in that one. The kind of money that's coming his way.
See, the dynamic on that is different. And this is where the concern factor comes in about Saudis. They're not paying big transfer fees. What they're doing is they're breaking the ecosystem of wages. Transfer fees have value.
Yeah.
Because you capitalise them. The moment you write someone out a transfer fee, they're on your balance sheet. You spend 100 million quid over here, you replace them with a £100 million asset. You start paying wages, they just go out the door. They're a drain on profit. The problem with the Saudi League is that they're prepared to pay players £600,000 a week, £700,000 a week, £800,000 a week. They're not worried about transfer fees. We're not seeing the transfer fee market right now in Saudi. They're just paying sort of nominal fees, 10, 15 million, 20 million here. But what they're doing is they're going, we'll pay £50 million a year for a footballer. And then all of a sudden, footballers start saying to English Premier League clubs, the Liga football clubs, Serie A football clubs, and whoever else that's in football, hang on a second, I'm underpaid over here. I can go over to Saudi and I can get £600,000 a week.
Yeah.
And that's the danger and the jeopardy that results in the Saudi League.
Yeah.
And that's where the issue is.
That's right.
Wages.
And that's why Michael Emenalo out in the Saudi League, he's now chief executive, saying, don't worry, watch us go. We will get the biggest names in world football to come to Saudi Arabia, precisely for the reason that Simon's just outlined. It's coming up to 11:15.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.